Hi, I'm Earl Taylor, Chief Knowledge Officer at the Marketing Science Institute. As many of you know, MSI helps marketers become better marketers. Our business and academic thought leaders collaborate to create new marketing knowledge, which we share in a variety of ways. And one of the most popular is our online lecture series. Those of you attending today represent many business sectors such as insurance, entertainment, technology, CPG, and more, as well as MSI members such as Adobe, Nike, AAA, UPS, Walmart, Ford, and others. We're delighted to welcome you all to learn more about using Test and Learn framework. Now, before we begin, I'd like to point out the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please use this to feature to send through any questions you have during the presentation. We'll gather those questions and have a brief Q&A session following the presentation. Now I'd like to introduce you to today's featured speakers. And it's a special treat because both in many ways represent MSI at its best, the combination of academia and business. Michael Cohen is Senior Vice President, Data Science and Analytics at Marketing Evolution. He's a data product executive scientist and scholar with organizational leadership experience in many fields. He works collaboratively to build innovative results focused on technologies that unlock insights for business performance. But he also has strong academic ties and maintains a research program that develops data science for managerial decision making. And he has experience in categories such as digital media and e-commerce, food marketing, corporate social responsibility, and competitive strategy. Ellie Feit is the Assistant Professor of Marketing at Drexel University and a Senior Fellow at the Wharton School. And her research focuses on solving product design and advertising problems using Bayesian statistics and experimental design. She's had, in the course of her career, done work at General Motors with the analytics firm The Modelers, and most recently, prior to her appointment at Drexel, as Executive Director of the Wharton Customer Analytics Initiative, where she built the Academic Industry Partnership Program. So you can see we have two very well-qualified people today to talk to us about using Test and Learn to validate results. So with that, I'll turn things over to Michael.
Thanks, Earl. I'm really glad to be here once again to talk about something that's really near and dear to my heart, which is Test and Learn. Now, the Test and Learn I'll be talking about today isn't necessarily a methodology for experimentation, but it's more of a mindset, an organizational mindset or framework that incorporates specific methods that we've come up with in marketing science and best practices for measurement. But this is really about coordinating a marketing organization around data-driven decision making and what goes into that at a high level. So what are the essential elements here that I've broken things down to in this framework? It's to start off by collecting and validating data, then understanding that data using both human and machine intelligence. Data, we believe as marketers and marketing scientists, that data comes from models, and the idea here is to recover those models. Because that's what we can use to help drive decisions. So that's what's happening in this step, all that fun marketing science and analytics. Then once we have those results, we want to validate those insights and actually make actions based on them, put those actions into the marketplace, and then evaluate them. And evaluation isn't just about evaluating the performance of the marketing, it's about evaluating the performance of our entire measurement program. So we can think about a world in which we don't use data-driven decision making, or we don't use analytics or marketing science to drive our decisions, which we've done for a long time, versus a world that we do. So we can understand what our investment is worth. What is the return on investment of standing up a program? So there's a program evaluation component to this that's pretty critical these days. Putting it all together, this is going to be something that we go through, that we cycle through. We start always with data collection, go through the 4 steps, and then update. So if we look closer at this data collection and validation, what sort of things are we talking about? Collecting data from existing sources and adding new ones when appropriate. It could be new data that comes because we've moved forward in time, but it could be data that's suddenly available because a new technology has helped us capture it, or because it's a new marketing channel that we're testing out as a possibility. There's always an opportunity to incorporate new data signals into our intelligence. There's also an opportunity here to provide new business context or updates to the business. So not all data comes in large flat formats. Some of it comes from, you know, the organization, the way they work, their understanding of the marketplace. That needs to be incorporated in the set of information that we'll use to do the analytics. And then the one that, you know, we don't take enough stock of is some of the initial steps of validation, which is the data on time? Is it here? If we can't kick off the process of analyzing the data, it's not going to affect our business decisions in a timely manner. I can't emphasize this enough, like ensuring that the data is on time and that there's a way, if the data is not on time, to expedite its updating, making sure the right stakeholders are aware, notified, and have easy ways to update the data so it can, you know, affect the business and affect the culture of decision making based on data. Then you step into a process of complete validation. Does it reflect our understanding of the truth, either through the accounting ledger or our knowledge about the journeys our consumers take that we're ultimately interested in influencing? By way of example, the data collection process is really about just curating and normalizing the data, putting it into standard schemas and making sure that those schemas and the taxonomy of them align with the way that we do business and the way we make decisions. Are they organized by channel? Do you manage by channel? Do you manage by campaign or message? This is going to determine how we organize data and then set up our analytics. Providing new context, and just an example of how you're buying media. You might have the data, but to know that, you know, you buy one source of media that's oriented towards upper funnel or brand building awareness based on impressions and lower funnel media based on clicks is absolutely critical knowledge for any sort of analyst or scientist to have when they set up their models or analytic framework. And I've mentioned the validation steps of, is the data on time? Are the responsible parties notified? Do we have, you know, all the data that we need to provide an insight, or are we all talking about the same thing? If we're talking about all the digital media, have we captured all of that, each and every tactic, and does it represent the business? Next step is, I'm just calling understanding. I'd love to call this science or analytics, since it, you know, this incorporates the fun topics of modeling, econometrics, machine learning. All of those aspects are happening in this step. The idea being to recover the process that generates the data. That's what I'm trying to do. Understand my customers. The data comes from my customers. It comes from the marketplace. It comes from the strategic interaction of these entities, and that's what I'm looking to recover, because once I know that, once I understand my customers, then I have a way to influence them to drive the KPIs that I'm interested in driving. You know, part of that is the machine intelligence, the learning and forgetting in the models, such that they're fresh, they represent the marketplace and the time, the decision-making horizon, that sort of thing. But that you know, the human implementation is up to date, and that we're tracking things in a way that aligns with the overall business strategy, depending on where the business is in a growth mode, in a maintain market share mode, extract profit. All of these pieces are going to be important to the framework that we put around this, you know, whether we're talking about how we test or how we use insights to make decisions. By way of example, you know, a type of machine intelligence might be Bayesian learning, the way I update or forget some sort of insights. From a rigorous perspective, Bayesian learning provides a framework to do this. From the human intelligence perspective, knowing that there's some sort of confound in media that's targeted to high intent shoppers. I mean, we know that this data that we're using is observational. It's coming from the marketplace, and it isn't pristine from an experimental sort of perspective. Having that understanding and looking at results and bringing that intelligence to the analytics process is critical. And this is where, there is a critical role for the human, whether that's the analyst or the user or the manager or the buyer of the media, to bring this sort of insight to interpret results correctly, right? You get a result that looks like it doesn't really measure the impact of marketing, it incorporates something else like shopper intent, then the result should be framed that way. There's nothing wrong with the result, it's just characterizing it correctly that's important here. So as you stand up a data-driven decision-making program, one of the mindsets that's critical is that you're sort of always wrong and you're just trying to minimize that. Right? This is like the typical statistical problem setup is minimizing error. Well, this is the human setup. And we're always going to evolve in our understanding and improve that. Once we accept that, it'll be easier to start to build that bridge towards data-driven decision-making. So comparing and explaining differences through iterations. Now, technology allows us to make those iterations quicker and make them happen more in line with, closer to real time, or at least in right time. And as things change as we expect them to, that we make comparisons and that we can explain those differences in order to get buy-in. As we use this information to make decisions, start by making small adjustments and see feedback from the marketplace about the results that came from those. You can use your impact model to assess these, or you can use independent experimentation to validate those. In-field random experimentation is a great use case there for focused validity testing. And when we do this, we should always focus on business outcomes to establish economic validity. We talk a lot in statistics and marketing science about whether a model is good or valid from a statistical perspective. But as I think you'll at least talk more about later, when we use these things as managers, we need them to be valid from the business's perspective. And those are two different objectives. And it's important that if we're using these things to drive improvement in the business, that we have that orientation when we think about accounting for the uncertainty and the risk that we take on when making decisions that are based on data. So just a small example here. The example I have in mind is a marketer at a bank that's running a media campaign to increase off-cadence deposits, right? People have regular deposits set up, but the bank wants to increase that deposit activity by providing reminders. They do so in various ways. They have, email is still a very effective medium for driving this sort of behavior. And then there's support from TV that, makes the brand relevant and salient in the customer's mind. So, they're collecting data on deposits and TV exposure and email sends, using this to implement a holdout test. Some of the intelligence that's brought to the table here is that, okay, I have a list of individuals on my email list. They're already people that are with the bank, and I'm delivering emails to people that are high intent as it is. So I need to piece out the part that is intent to really understand what that incremental or marginal effect is of that message that's been sent to the individual. So we run a holdout test to provide that experimental variation and estimate a model that links TV and email delivery to these off-cadence deposits. Notice that I'm mentioning using random experimentation within a modeling framework. These are not substitutes for one another. You can exploit this sort of random variation and experimentation within a modeling framework. The modeling framework is important because it accounts for the whole consumer decision process, or attempts to. And it's useful for applying to the managerial decision-making that we're talking about, in that usually when a manager is asking a question, it's a what if. So if you're asking what if questions or optimization questions, the model that you have is going to be representative of the consumer, and that, a good way to ensure that that model, represents this causal relationship is that, some random variation is plausibly there in the marketplace to identify that link. So to validate the insight, just by virtue of having a good, clean, random experiment, there's a source of validation in there. But that's only, from this causal perspective. You want to validate that insight from an activation perspective. And no matter what the level of uncertainty is, in your first steps as activating off of some data, that you start small. You deploy things to the market in a way that makes sense according to the insight, and you get feedback from the marketplace. So in this case, the activation would suggest something like drop those deposit reminders around emails to those that have been exposed to TV audiences. Having that consumer-centric view is critical here in figuring out which audiences are ripe for the email messages that help drive those off-cadence deposits. So just a call out for some of the work that Ellie and her colleagues have done. They've done work formally in academia that looks at, optimal testing from the perspective of the managerial objective. And I think it's super important work in the context here, because it shifts the conversation about validity from a statistical one to a managerial one, and really brings together the stakeholders in analytics and statistics together with the managers and their incentives. Additionally, can we use the data to be smart about the way we experiment? Can we learn more if we use this historic information to, say, stratify our sample to improve the confidence in our estimates? And in this work, they're showing how that plays out. But this is super important stuff that's practical to how we are always improving our experimentation, improving our decisions, and getting feedback from the market to drive those forward. The final step here is really about evaluating the program. As I said, you can evaluate the effectiveness of and efficiency of the tactical decisions or deployment that an insight suggests, or the campaign, or even at a strategic level, the strategic investment allocation. But a big part of this, and a big question that's asked within organizations, lots of money are spent on analytics. What is the return on the investment from that program? And that's absolutely critical. It's critical to the financial stakeholders, and just ensuring that the program that you've stood up is actually driving the business better than without or another program. So there's a couple different ways to think about this. And essentially, in either of those cases, one of them is like an inexpensive way to do this evaluation. One of them is a more expensive, but there's going to be some sort of experimental condition. And then the data-driven, that's the data-driven recommendation, right? There's a set of recommendations, and we're trying to determine, what the value is of those recommendations that are based on data versus not having data, the business as usual outcome. So we can do this in an inexpensive way by actually using a model to the extent that it's now accepted and valid through the lens of the business and the stakeholders, to actually use that model to evaluate these counterfactuals. What would happen had I done the other thing, or I used some different strategy or heuristic to allocate and deploy my media versus what's recommended. The model itself will give you a sense of what the delta is, or the return is, to some KPI of focus. And then you can understand, what the ROI is, because you know what your investment is in that measurement program. Now, something that, an approach that would be more costly is to actually hold out those recommendations from the marketplace and evaluate that program independent of the actual modeling or analytic framework you have. So depending on the level of rigor you need to apply and how much money you have, these would be two different options for program evaluation. Finally, once you get up and running and you do this over and over again, you build confidence in this, you scale it up, you extend it to more media channels, you do it more rapidly, you make it more automated, you get direct connections into buying platforms, and you start to see, quicker returns. But it requires a building up of that confidence, not just in terms of performance, but from an organizational perspective. So that's really the key ingredient here. You can't have a successful test and learn program without an organizational champion behind test and learn that's actually, anointed at a very high level to, do that change management within the organization. This requires, changing people's compensations arrangements, their goal orientation, coordinating goals around this test and learn mindset. The biggest barrier to adopting analytic solutions is that there's always some sort of excuse, or that stuff comes too late. You have a data controller. If that data gets caught up for some reason, then it's not affecting decisions in time. The measurement program isn't paying off. It gets retired. There could be an individual that, the insight doesn't necessarily align with the way that they're being compensated or buying media. There stands a chance that they'll not be adopting this. So somebody really has to have the oversight and then really drive this behavior and coordination within the organization and or other organizational stakeholders. That might be an agency or some player like that. But without this, you'll never get the sort of adoption and change that is required to become a data-driven organization, which is absolutely critical. I'll pass it off to Ellie.
Sure. Thanks very much for that presentation, Michael. I think you've really laid out what it takes to build a comprehensive system for assessing your marketing. Obviously there's a lot of folks on the webinar today that are really interested in that topic, and it's clear that you're down in the trenches and have thought about the details of how to make this work. What I'd like to do is step back and just go over what I think are three really key components that you've talked about today. And those are having unified data sources, incorporating randomized holdouts, and focusing on ROI. And I'd actually like to start with the third one of those, ROI. We teach this all the time in intro marketing, but we teach it really fast and we kind of move on because it's hard. But if you take an ROI perspective on your marketing, it will really focus you possibly in a new way. Not all of marketing culture is ROI oriented, I know. But just to remind you, ROI is just this little formula where you take the gains that you get from any kind of investment minus the costs over the costs. And figuring out the cost in the case of media is easy, right? You just call your agency and they'll tell you what different kinds of media cost. And the reason we've always skipped over this in intro marketing class is that figuring out the gains can be really hard. But I want to reassure the audience that we're at the precipice of being able to do that really well, so that you can identify, all of this marketing science is trying to identify that incremental sales lift that you get for a particular type of media. And that incremental lift could be in terms of revenue. It could be in terms of behaviors of customers, like site visits or trips to a store, those kinds of behaviors, or attitudes. But if you can't think of something that you're looking at a particular marketing tactic and you can't think of a way that it is going to improve revenue, customer behaviors, or customer attitudes, if you can't identify it, you might be looking at a boondoggle. And boondoggle is a marketing effort that's certainly fun for the marketers, but maybe not that impactful for the business. So I'm really encouraged to see practitioners like Michael really helping their clients focus on an ROI perspective for their media planning. The second component I wanted to talk about is randomized holdouts or randomized controls. So the idea of a randomized holdout is that we take any media campaign that we have and we randomly select people who should have been exposed to that campaign and we don't expose them. And there's a reason this is super important. First of all, think about this example, the first one I have listed on the slide. If I send an email to all of my potential customers, then I have absolutely no data that would tell me how many of those customers would have bought without the email, because they all got the email. So randomized controls are one way of introducing that variation that we need, that the marketing scientists need in order to figure out the lift associated with that particular email. But there's a second, slightly more persnickety and evil problem, which is, even imagine I send the email to some of my customers and I send it to all of my best potential customers. Well, then I could, in theory, compare the customers who got the email to the customers who didn't get the email to try to figure out that sales lift from the email. But it's not a fair comparison, because I divided the customers based on how good I thought they were as prospects. And that has a technical name in the marketing science community called endogeneity. And randomized holdouts are beautiful because they break this. So they break this endogeneity, they solve the problem, because we know that if it was a coin toss that decided who was going to get the email and who wasn't going to get the email, then that is a fair comparison on average between those two groups. And it's a super powerful tactic. And if you're just at the beginning of your sort of media measurement journey, and you're not ready for kind of all the pieces that Michael talked about, one of the easiest sort of first tactics is to take randomized holdouts and try to put them into all of your media. Now, actually doing that takes some, thinking and tactics. For email, it's pretty easy. You just don't send the email. Once you get into display advertising or television or other media, it gets trickier. But this is starting to happen, to percolate into the media companies. So as an advertiser, you should be asking about this for every single media channel that you manage. Is there a way we can introduce some randomized holdouts into our media campaign so that we can get a sense of the lift? And if your agency or media company isn't ready to answer that question, then you might need to find a different media agency or media provider. So holdouts add the perfect variation for estimating ad response. And as Michael mentioned, you can combine randomized holdouts with models. And if you want to see an example of that, I have a paper from a few years ago where we did just that with a major catalog and email marketer. The third thing, so that's holdouts. The third thing that Michael talked about at the beginning of his talk is this idea that we need unified data. So if you want to understand how all your media work and how your media are working together, we need to create these unified databases that record all of the marketing touches at the user level and stitch those between media as much as we possibly can. So get my ideal data set, this is not always possible, is a data set where I have user ID, the channel, whether that's television, email, website, whatever, the date and time, and that a touch occurred. And just a log of that for all of the customers. And that makes the data consistent across channels. And then the last part of that is to make that sort of data totally accessible to everyone on the marketing team, from the agency to the marketers at the advertiser. Everyone should have transparent access to that data. It shouldn't be kind of squirreled away and hidden or too complicated to look at. And on the right there, I have a picture depicting the three billy goats gruff. So some of you may have in your time run into a data troll. So a data troll is someone who holds data, and they've basically built a career out of requiring, their career is that they provide access to the data. They're the only one that can access it, read it, understand it. And that is the exact opposite of what we need in sort of modern data-driven business environments. So those of you who don't know the three billy goats gruff story, there were three billy goats that wanted to get across a bridge to get to a meadow where there was some lush grass. And there was a troll who lived under the bridge. And when the first little billy goat came along, he said, I have to eat one of you. If these three brothers are going to cross the bridge, one of you has to be sacrificed for my lunch. And the littlest billy goat says, wait for my brothers, they're bigger than me. And then the second billy goat comes across the bridge, same story. He says, wait for my brothers, wait for my big brother. He's much bigger, he'll make a better lunch for you. And then the biggest billy goat comes along. The troll says, I have to eat you. That's the toll for getting over the bridge. And the biggest billy goat pushes him down the river. And so the data troll is gone, and the billy goats can happily eat their lush grass. And that's something that a lot of organizations need to I think it's a story that can help advise organizations on how to deal with these kind of data trolls. You need to get someone big and powerful to push them down the river so that everyone can have access to the data. And you want to replace those data trolls with what I call a data librarian, which is someone who collects that data, makes it accessible to the team, answers any questions, makes sure that the metadata is clear, solves problems when there's something that smells fishy in the data, all of that. So we really need to build up these kinds of data librarians. There's some great technology tools that can help them these days with sort of big data technology tools. But you also need that person who will help coordinate across channels and make it accessible to everyone, including the marketing scientists. So just to summarize, the three things that I think are super important when you're thinking about putting together a comprehensive media measurement system are to have unified data, to have randomized holdouts, and to focus on ROI. And there are small steps that every advertiser can take to make all three of those things better within their organization today as they're thinking long-term about some sort of grand unified media measurement system. So that's all I have. I guess I'll turn it over to Earl for the Q&A.
Yes, thanks very much, Michael and Ellie, both. That was great. Nice tag team handoff there. A couple of quick questions of kind of clarification nature, and then some broader issues that I think have been raised by what you both have shared with us. There was an initial question about Michael's reference to measuring TV brand exposure. That would be presumably from one of the purchase data sets in Nielsen or something like that. Is that what you're alluding to, Michael?
So yeah, I mean, what we have available to us is information that comes from devices. TVs are devices, just like mobile phones, tablets, desktop computers, this sort of thing. So we know about exposures on devices, and then we know who's tied to those devices. So there's device resolution, identity resolution, and that allows you to get exposure resolution to a consumer's journey through the marketplace and the behaviors that they engage in, the things they do, ultimately the KPI that the marketer is interested in driving. But yes, the ability to anonymously record and tie those points together in a unified way, as Ellie points out, is what's being done here, and it's usually, for different types of devices or data, it's being done in different ways. So TVs now, we're, relying on smart TVs and their ability to record exposure.
Yeah, that's a good. Go ahead, Ellie.
I'll jump in, Earl. I've been following this for the past 10 years because I'm kind of obsessed with figuring out if ads work. And of course, the most important kind of ads are television ads. The cable companies are also, in addition to smart TVs, the cable companies themselves are basically starting to operate like a digital platform. So the new Comcast X1 box is a Linux box under the hood, and they actually can collect data on TV exposures for those customers. Getting those stitched to other media is still work that's ongoing. But having seen what's happened in the last 10 years, I'm hopeful that by the end of the next 10 years, this sort of unified data thing will be a solved problem.
One other thing
I was going to actually, go ahead, Michael.
Jump in and point out is that bringing all the data together isn't the end of making that data analytics ready. So as you might guess, the ability to stitch the data together is non-random. So you end up with a data set that's not necessarily representative of the marketplace you want to learn about. There's a bunch of sampling and weighting and statistical approaches that need to be made to make that data representative and make it true up to, we know, the overall exposure to media, the KPI activity, and the cross-section of the consumer universe is. And that's important. It's not enough to just bring the data together.
Yeah, Beth made a comment just now, comment and question. I think we're not quite there yet. As Ellie said, we're approaching that kind of having the unified data set, the 360 view of the consumer viewing behavior. We're not quite there, but some of the things you discussed earlier, I think, are about practical ways to combine that. Noof wondered if you could give kind of at least a conceptual framework or an outlook of how would you describe kind of an adequate model? What would be an example, maybe from your own experience, of the elements that go in to make a good model?
Do you want to take that, Michael?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it. So a good model is one, in the short definition, is one that improves business outcomes above what you'd have had you not done any modeling or analytic exercise at all. So it could be a bad model, right? Even like a random control test in isolation is a bad model because the R-squared is low, right? But the causal measurement is good, and it gives you a good insight, and you can act on it. So this is part of, does my insight actually drive business versus what I would do had I not had that insight, and then evaluate that against the investment. Now the question is, how pristine is your experiment to evaluate that? And I mentioned too, one, you could use a model to evaluate what that counterfactual world would be had you not activated in the way that the analytics directed you to. But you can also actually do this in the marketplace. Say, hey, use these data-driven insights over here and don't use them over there if you like that, and conduct a difference in difference sort of study. That's a rigorous way to demonstrate that stuff is working. But we really need to push away from the notion that mechanical fit is a way of, that sometimes that rears its head in discussions.
Yeah, I was going to compliment you and comment on that as an answer to the question, because I think a lot of folks would have jumped right into various types of modeling approaches and tests of significance and so forth. And I think rightly, in keeping with what both of you have talked about, is a good model is one that improves business decision making. And you also made an important point I wanted to follow up on, Michael, and Ellie, you can weigh in as well. And that is sort of, don't let the best be the enemy of the good, or start incrementally and then improve. The whole test and learn as a kind of a feedback loop, the way you described it, is maybe a new way of thinking about marketing. You're not going to get the answer once and for all and then go to market with that and nothing changes. We know it's a dynamic environment. So we're always adjusting mid-course if possible. That goes back to the timeliness of the data. So maybe for the audience, because I know they face these practical challenges, a little bit more about sort of working back from the business decision and the cadence of decision making to a model that supports that and sort of gets better as it goes. Let the market tell you what is a good model.
Yeah, can I take that one, Earl?
Please.
So one way to think about this is the ultimate decision that we're always trying to make in these problems is, should we spend money on a particular media channel? So I think the first step is sort of organizational, and saying to whoever you buy that media from, saying to them directly, I am going to start assessing the performance of your media. And I want, this is how I'm going to do it, but I'm open to your suggestions about how to do it as well. And having a frank conversation that you are assessing whether or not that media is worth what it's costing you. Having that kind of frank, open dialogue will actually, should dial up the media firms' openness about data. They're going to try to get better measurements. So there was a question earlier about whether or not, how do you get consistency across channels? Well, if you tell the media firm that I'm going to be evaluating you on this, they're going to get better at providing you data about it. because you're saying this is part of the incentives of the system now. So I think that kind of open conversation is one of the first places that folks should start when they're trying to take the first step down this journey.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it has a lot wider currency in my experience too, is we can build the proverbial better mousetrap and come up with all those answers, but if the way we then try to influence someone else's actions or behavior doesn't align with their incentives and so forth, we may not get very far. And so I love your idea of sort of getting the media company on board from the get-go, and it should be a win-win outcome. They have an interest in having your efforts be more effective as you do, and sometimes it's pictured as an adversarial relationship, but clearly these models and this approach is one way to really align incentives on both sides. That's a great point. Sort of along the same lines, going back to some of the organizational issues you both talked about, Michael had a question about how do you really get the organization to make the kind of change? I guess I made a note to myself as you were talking. It's thinking of test and learn mindset as an agent for culture change. I mean, it is chicken and egg, and one has to change so the other can happen. But both of your thoughts may be about the role of test and learn mindset as a change agent inside organizations so that you do align the way you've described.
Yeah, Ellie and I were talking the other day, and in her career before she was in marketing management, so much as in supply chain and stuff like that. And people have been using these ideas in other areas of the firm for a much longer time. And they've gone through the process of using data and experimentation. And, she can testify that when these things were being adopted at that time, it was critical to have that champion for the mindset that is anointed by the board or by some C-level executive to go in and shake things up, change the compensation incentives, change the contracts with the agencies, and invest in the data. I'd say without that, you don't see the changes. And I think that there's a recipe for this in other areas of the firm that have learned that this is the mindset to adopt, long before marketing came around to it.
Ellie, do you want to add to that?
No, I think Michael summarized it pretty well.
Let me raise a question I wanted to mention earlier. I think this is actually a good tie-in because back to kind of the use of test and learn mindset in those areas that are sort of data rich for internal operations, things like supply chain and operations of one kind or the other. I loved your metaphor or image, Ellie, of the data troll, and that was someone standing between you and data that if you had it, you knew would be valuable. Well, we have a lot of data where the troll usually isn't in the way anymore because it's internal to the company, but isn't there a kind of a corresponding potential pitfall there? That is that if we're only using data about current operations and optimizing current operations, there's kind of a built-in status quo bias. There's the myopia of only focusing on your current franchise and maybe not engaging the next tier of customers that you could bring in, because by definition, you don't have the same data on them. So it's the old, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Sometimes turns into we only manage those things that we can measure, and we can measure current activities, so let's manage that. And it really is not preparing us then for a changing future. Yeah.
Terrific.
Ellie.
Terrific point, Earl. What I like to say in those situations is I've been toying with this idea of what I call a push-in, which is the opposite of a holdout. So there might be media channels or customer segments that you don't know very much about, but you should, if you want to learn more about them, you should be, so that you don't myopically focus on what you're currently doing, you should be doing these little push-ins where you say, okay, instead of doing a randomized holdout, because this is a segment I know I want to hit, I'm going to do a randomized push-in. I'm going to send the media to like 10% of the people to see how it performs. And I think that's a really good, that you should allocate some of your budget to doing that kind of exploration of new media channels, new segments. I don't know what else you had in mind, Earl.
Well, I think that speaks to that. By the way, we should trademark that, and I'll split the royalties with you. Michael, let me ask you about that though, because you talked about using the model as, to run policy experiments, what-if scenarios, and again, I like the fact that your way of thinking in the modeling and talking about it uses the language of the managers. Managers are being asked to say, what if I did this? What if I did that? So you're giving them feedback in a way that kind of gears in with their natural way of thinking. Do you feel like on a proper data set, properly analyzed, some of these what-if scenarios, the modeling opportunity in the model could actually address some of these issues so that you're not sort of captive with the current database? You can actually run what-if scenarios. Is that a possible answer to this challenge of sort of being caught in the echo chamber?
Certainly. I mean, if you have a model that captures, the salient dynamics of the marketplace without any large structural change, like we can go out with a completely new brand or something like that, it's a first look, and it's much less expensive than in market experimentation. It also, just by virtue of writing down a model, it enriches the way that we think about the complex interactions of customers with the media, the platforms, all of those things. Sometimes writing down a model creates a conversation that gets people to then do some activation, get feedback, and learn in that way. But that's really the strength of a model, to be able to, evaluate the world had it had been different, without actually, splitting the universe.
Right. In some ways, for some categories at least, this is maybe the alternative or the equivalent to the old, the test market. Put it out in the real marketplace. Let's wait and see what happens. In some cases, you can maybe accelerate that process. Both of you have made.
Earl, I want to throw a little cold water on that, which is, the models are only as good as the data that they're built on, looping back to the first question you had. So a good model might tell you, heck, I don't know what's going to happen. A good model captures this uncertainty and might make a prediction that is, if you do that, those customers might produce $10 of revenue or $1,000 of revenue. I don't know. And so you run into the limits of the data eventually.
No, that's good advice, and it also, I think, it goes back to what you both said different ways, which is start incrementally, build, kind of use the feedback loop to improve the model, and that way you are capturing those dynamic elements of the marketplace that Michael referred to. I love his expression too early on that we're always wrong. We're just trying to minimize the error by building these models. I think, again, we often think of we'll build the perfect model, and then to your point, Ellie, it answers all questions. Well, no, it's almost certainly wrong. It's just some are more wrong than others. And what you've described is a way for kind of sussing out the most helpful, least wrong of these models.
Yeah, if someone gives you a lift number for media, your next question should be, what's your uncertainty range on that? What do you think is the range of likely lifts for that?
Well, and I'm glad you said that, because that was the other thing that struck me that both of you pointed out, and Michael, when he used that expression about trying to just minimize how wrong we are. I think it also educates your audience, that is the managers relying on these models and insights, that this is probabilistic. This is not a black or white. They'd love to live in a black or white, yes or no go, no go world, and they're being asked to make those decisions, but you're giving them ranges of probability or ranges of error around those go, no go decisions. You're minimizing the danger of making the wrong decision, but it's not a black and white, typically it's not a black and white yes or no answer to almost any of these that these models will produce. One other thing, Ellie, I know Michael referred to the paper that you and Berman did, and we, thanks to you, have that in our working paper series for those MSI members on the audience today. I love the thing about the test and roll, the point that you made about the opportunity cost of using a holdout group or a control group or something, people that aren't targeted for the treatment. They don't buy the product as a result, but it allows you to learn those who do and why. But the soonest you know that information and the sooner you roll out the campaign or whatever it might be, the better you're succeeding in the marketplace. So it's kind of a trade-off between getting it perfectly right or good enough answer that allows you to begin to execute. So maybe I think that's very much in keeping with what both of you have shared today. So why don't you share a little bit more about that work that you did on the kind of test and roll approach to an ad campaign?
Yeah, so today I was advocating these randomized holdouts, and every time I talk to managers about it, they think like, I'm actually going to take an ad that I think works and not expose some people to it. That sounds like really a waste, and it is potentially a waste. So the test and roll framework allows you to actually figure out what's the optimal amount that you should do that. Just as you explained, Earl, what's the optimal size of that test so that then we can move forward to decision making. But I actually want to mention the other paper, so that paper is Fight and Berman. There's this other paper, Berman and Fight, which answers a question that Mike had in the Q&A, which is how to gain statistical significance with low response rate media. So one of the things we can do to improve the power of our holdout test or our models is to bring in variables that we know about customers. So as you create this unified database where you have all the marketing touches and you know the history of the customer, you can start to bring in that history of the customer into the model. So there's some people that we know are really heavy buyers no matter whether we media expose them or not. They're just good customers. There's other customers who are highly responsive to media. So once you can start establishing that in your data and creating segments, then you can increase the power of your models and tests quite a lot by separating people out into their various groups.
Well, that's, I think, a nice, clean note to end on. Thanks very much to both of you again. I want to thank the audience for being with us and let you know that we will be sending out a recording of the webinar soon. And if you have additional questions for either Michael or Ellie, you have the email addresses, I think, on the final screen there. And I know that each would like to hear from you and perhaps continue this discussion. And for our audience as a whole, I want to remind you that since 1961, nonprofit MSI has brought together the best minds in marketing from major corporations and top business schools around the world to improve business practice by applying science to marketing's biggest challenges. And again, thanks both to Michael and Ellie for a great presentation, good Q&A discussion, and we'll look forward to seeing you all at our next Lunch and Learn webinar.